Early on the evening of Sunday, the 27th of November, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods was leaning towards the mirror in her small New York City apartment. She was carefully applying her eyeliner, her hands steady, a skill she'd perfected over countless nights just like this one. Her phone, sitting on the bathroom counter next to her makeup, buzzed. She heard it, but she didn't even glance over to see who was calling. She just didn't have the time. Her shift started at 7, and she couldn't afford to be late. Catherine had moved to the city from Ohio 3 years earlier. She had that big, bright dream that pulls so many people to New York. She wanted to be a dancer on Broadway. She imagined her name in lights, the roar of the crowd, the feeling of being on stage under the hot theatrical lights. But New York City is an expensive place to have a dream. Just existing here costs a fortune. So, in between chasing that Broadway dream, she was working. A lot. She actually had 3 different jobs just to keep her head above water, to pay the rent, and to afford the lessons she needed to even have a shot at her dream. 2 of her jobs were pretty normal. She was a waitress at a busy diner, where she was quick on her feet and had a friendly smile that earned her good tips. She also taught dance classes to little kids, their energy and enthusiasm a welcome contrast to the cynicism of the city. She loved seeing their faces light up when they nailed a new step. But tonight, she was getting ready for her 3rd job. And this job was different. It wasn't something she talked about. In fact, she was deeply embarrassed by it, and she kept it a secret from almost everyone she knew, especially her family back in Ohio. Her 3rd job was at a place near Times Square called Flash Dancers. She was a topless dancer. Catherine really, truly hated the work. The leering eyes, the fake smiles she had to put on, the way it made her feel. But the money was good. It was really good. And that money was the fuel for her dream. It paid for the expensive voice lessons and the advanced dance classes that were essential if she was ever going to make it to Broadway. She lived in Manhattan, the most expensive borough in an already incredibly expensive city. She knew she could save a lot of money if she moved to a cheaper neighborhood in a different borough like Queens or Brooklyn. And when she had first arrived in New York, that's exactly what she'd done. She'd found a small place in a less expensive area, thinking she was being smart and practical. But that practicality had come at a terrifying cost. Her landlord there had sexually assaulted her. The experience was so traumatic, so violating, that it nearly broke her. For a while, she seriously considered just giving up, packing her bags, and moving back home to Ohio, leaving the city and her dream behind forever. It felt like the city itself had chewed her up and spit her out. But in the end, after a lot of soul-searching, she decided to stay. She was a fighter. She wasn't going to let one horrible man destroy everything she had worked for. But she did make a change. She moved. She found her current apartment in a much safer part of Manhattan, where she felt she could walk down the street at night without constantly looking over her shoulder. To help with the much higher rent, she got a roommate. His name was David Hahn. He was 23, and he was a familiar face from back home in Ohio, a little piece of her old life in this new, overwhelming city. At this very moment, as Catherine was finishing her makeup, David wasn't in the apartment. He'd gone downstairs a few minutes ago to get his car, which was parked a few blocks away. He was going to drive her to her shift at the club. Catherine finished with her eyeliner, satisfied with the clean, sharp line. She left the bathroom and walked through the small living room. On the floor, a black dog was sleeping soundly. She had to step carefully over it. The dog wasn't hers, and it wasn't David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter. It was one of the many side jobs he juggled to make ends meet, just like her. This particular dog was just staying with them for a few days while its owners were out of town. When David wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a fancy hotel just up the street from their apartment building. Catherine and David had a history that was a bit complicated. They had actually been a couple at one point. They dated for a little while after he followed her to New York. But these days, they were just friends, just roommates, splitting the bills to survive in the city. Although, if Catherine was being honest with herself, she sometimes wondered if they should give it another shot. Just a few days ago had been Thanksgiving. Instead of making the long trip back to Ohio like she usually did, she had stayed in New York and celebrated with David. Just the two of them. And it had been really nice. It felt comfortable, easy, like coming home. A big part of what she appreciated about him was that he knew about her job at Flash Dancers. He was one of the very few people who did, and he didn't judge her for it. He understood why she was doing it, and that lack of judgment was a rare and precious thing. But there was one major hurdle she could see if they were to ever get back together. It was David's attitude towards other men in her life. He seemed to dislike basically every single man she ever met or dated. It didn't matter who they were. He just had this immediate, almost instinctual distrust of them. Now, with some of the guys, she could kind of see his point. There was a guy named Joe she had dated for a short time. She had met him at the strip club. He was a customer. David had been very clear that he thought Joe was bad news. And in hindsight, he was probably right. But then there were other guys, like Paul. Paul was a personal trainer at her gym. She'd gone on a few dates with him, but it was nothing serious. They were more like friends who spoke on the phone every now and then. Paul had always been perfectly nice to David, polite and friendly whenever he saw him. But David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just had a bad feeling about him. For now, though, Catherine pushed those thoughts aside. She didn't have time to sort out her entire romantic life. She just needed to get dressed and get downstairs before David started wondering where she was. She went into her bedroom, and that's when she heard it. The dog in the living room suddenly started barking. It wasn't a playful bark. It was sharp, insistent, like it was barking at something or someone. Curious, Catherine walked out of her bedroom to see what was going on. A little while later, David Hahn was walking quickly along the sidewalk, his breath misting in the cool November air. He was heading to his car, parked several blocks away from the apartment. He was already feeling a bit rushed. He finally reached the car, jumped in, and started the engine. He drove back towards his building, navigating the busy Sunday evening traffic. As he pulled up to the curb in front of his apartment, he took out his phone and called Catherine. He expected her to answer right away, to say she was on her way down. But the call went straight to voicemail. That was odd. He tried again. Voicemail again? He sighed, a little annoyed, and put his hazard lights on. He got out of the car and headed into the building to go get her. He took the stairs 2 at a time up to the second floor. As he turned down the hallway towards his apartment, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, standing right in the middle of the shared hallway, was the black dog he was supposed to be dog-sitting. Somehow, it had gotten out of the apartment. David just stared for a second, totally confused. Then he realized there was someone else there. His neighbor, a man named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. Brad was holding a leash, and it was clipped onto the dog's collar. Brad looked a bit surprised to see David, and David was just trying to process what was happening. Why did his neighbor have the dog on a leash in the hallway? Brad spoke first. He explained that he'd been coming up the stairs and had found the dog just wandering around by itself. He said he recognized it as David's dog, so he'd brought it back to their door. Brad said he had just knocked, but nobody had answered. At this point, David understood why Brad had the dog, but the bigger question was still unanswered. How did the dog get out in the first place? He didn't ask, though. He just thanked Brad, took the leash, and stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The door was closed, but when he tried the handle, he found that it was unlocked. He couldn't remember if he'd left it unlocked when he went to get the car. It wasn't something he would normally do. He pushed the door open and called out Catherine's name. There was no answer. Just silence. And that was really weird. She should have been right there, waiting for him. He stepped inside, the dog trailing behind him. He didn't see Catherine in the living room, but he did see that the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open. He walked over to it and called her name again. Catherine, we're going to be late. Still nothing. He pushed on her door, expecting it to swing open. But it didn't. It moved maybe a few inches and then stopped hard. He could feel resistance from the other side, like something heavy was on the floor blocking the door from opening. And now, with all these strange little things piling up the dog in the hall, the unlocked door, the silence, the blocked bedroom door, a feeling of serious worry started to wash over him. A surge of adrenaline hit him, and he put his shoulder into the door and shoved it hard. It flew open. He stuck his head inside to see what was blocking it, and when his eyes adjusted to the light, what he saw made him recoil instantly. He pulled back, stumbled out of the room, ran back into the hallway, fumbling for his phone, and called the police. About a half an hour later, around 7:30 in the evening, an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up the stairs of an apartment building in a nice part of Manhattan. This area was known for being extremely safe. Murders just didn't really happen here. But if the 911 call he'd just heard was accurate, he knew a potentially grisly murder scene was waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he got to the second-floor landing, he saw that a few other uniformed NYPD officers were already on the scene. One of them was talking to a young, skinny guy who was standing in the hallway looking completely distraught. The young man was holding a leash, and at the end of it was a black dog that was sitting quietly at his feet. Another officer saw Getz arrive and walked over to brief him. He said the man being interviewed was the victim's roommate, David Hahn. He was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment, in the back bedroom. Getz nodded, his face grim, and walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the open door of the apartment. His plan was always the same. He wanted to see the scene for himself before he started questioning anyone. Getz pulled on a pair of disposable rubber gloves and began his initial assessment. He carefully examined the doorframe of the apartment and then the door itself. He was looking for any signs of a break-in, any splintered wood or scratch marks around the lock. He saw nothing. No damage at all. That told him something important right away. Whoever did this either had a key or was let inside. He stepped into the apartment. The small living room was a little bit messy, but it was a lived-in messy, not a violent messy. The futon was pulled out into a bed, and there were some men's clothes strewn about. It just looked like a typical New York City apartment shared by young people. Getz moved slowly through the living room, taking care not to disturb anything. He headed towards the back of the apartment, towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was located. The door to the room was open just wide enough for him to slip through. When he stepped inside, the scene changed dramatically. There was blood everywhere. It was spattered on the walls, on the furniture. The room itself looked like a tornado had gone through it. It had been completely torn apart. A dresser drawer was hanging open, and women's clothing was scattered all over the floor. The mattress had been ripped completely off the bed frame and was now lying crookedly on the floor. That's what had been blocking the door from opening. And then, in the middle of all that chaos, in a large pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. On the front of her t-shirt, he saw a very clear, distinct shoe print. It looked as if her killer had literally stepped on her chest during or after the attack. There were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. He also saw what he immediately recognized as defensive wounds on her hands and her forearms, little cuts and slices that told him she had fought back hard against her attacker. She had fought for her life. But the worst of her injuries were to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat with such savage force that they had nearly decapitated her. To Detective Getz, this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was an attack fueled by an absolute, uncontrollable rage. At that moment, Getz heard footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. The blocked door was making it difficult for people to move in and out of the bedroom, so one of the first things the forensics team did was to carefully pick up the mattress from the floor. They leaned it up against the wall, out of the way, so the bedroom door could now swing open freely. With the team now able to access the room properly, Detective Getz stepped back and let them do their work. He watched as they meticulously documented everything. He saw them carefully lift the shoe print from the t-shirt Catherine was wearing. Then they found a second, identical shoe print on her bedsheets, and they collected that one as well. To Getz, both of these prints looked like they came from the exact same shoe. And just by looking at them, he could tell they were made by a man's shoe, probably an average size. This immediately made Detective Getz curious about something. He stepped out of the bedroom and back into the living room. He quickly found a couple of pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor near the futon. He picked one up and looked at the sole. While the tread pattern didn't match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, the size looked about right. They appeared to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 that night, Detective Getz sat down at a metal table inside an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. He slid a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim. And, at that moment, Detective Getz's number one suspect. The facts were simple and damning. There was no sign of forced entry at the apartment, which meant Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was let inside by someone who did. The murder weapon was a knife, and the sheer brutality of the attack screamed personal motivation. It felt like a crime of passion. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been completely trashed, nothing of value seemed to have been stolen. And because Catherine had been found partially undressed, a sexual motive was also a strong possibility. So Getz's working theory was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well, had easy access to her home, and possibly had a romantic or sexual connection to her. David Hahn fit that profile perfectly. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and took out his notepad, he did a quick, subtle scan of David's hands and forearms. He saw no visible cuts, no scrapes, no bruises. That was a little strange. Getz figured that a fight as violent as the one Catherine had put up would have almost certainly left a mark on her attacker. But he didn't mention this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward, his expression sympathetic, and asked David to walk him through everything that had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a little as he reached for the water bottle. He took a deep breath to try and calm his nerves. He said he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40. That's when he left to go get his car so he could drive her to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But, he said, getting his car had taken longer than he expected. On the way, he had run into a couple of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them for a few minutes. He said that after he finally got his car and drove back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting for him out on the curb. But when he got there, she was nowhere in sight. She didn't answer her phone when he called, so he'd gone inside and run upstairs. In the hallway, he said, he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was for some reason holding the leash of the dog David was supposed to be watching. Then David said he went into the apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. He said he called 911 immediately and that it was right around 7 o'clock. As David said this, Getz stopped writing on his notepad and just looked up at him. He could not believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he was only out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and in that tiny window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered, and her killer had managed to escape without anyone seeing them. It was, honestly, one of the weakest alibis Getz had ever heard in his career. But he didn't let his skepticism show. He didn't want David to know just how close he was to being arrested, because he didn't want David to shut down and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very calm and understanding as he asked how long David had known Catherine. David explained that they had met a few years ago back in Ohio while Catherine was home visiting family. They started dating, and he eventually decided to move to New York to be with her. But not long after he arrived, Catherine broke up with him, and she had asked him to move out of the apartment. David said he hadn't been able to afford a place of his own, so he had started sleeping in his car. He said Catherine had felt bad about that, and so she had eventually let him move back in, but on one condition, that he slept on the futon in the living room and that they were just roommates. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page. This new information was a bombshell. David wasn't just Catherine's roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend. A spurned ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see her alive and the first person to find her body. Getz was now more confident than ever that he was sitting across the table from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful. But he said he needed to go check on something really quick. David agreed to wait. As Getz stood up to leave, he stopped at the door and turned back. He asked David one last, seemingly casual question. He asked him what his shoe size was. Without a moment's hesitation, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down on his notepad, and then he left the room. What he didn't tell David was that the reason he was stepping out was to get some crucial updates from the forensics team and from the uniformed officers who were, at that very moment, questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to come back and use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, around 3 in the afternoon the next day, Detective Getz was sitting at his desk, feeling completely exhausted. He was pounding yet another cup of bitter office coffee. He had been up all night long interrogating David, who was still, at that very moment, sitting in an interrogation room just down the hall. Getz had also been going back and forth with his team, getting updates from forensics and from officers out in the field, and he still had a mountain of paperwork to get through before he could even think about going home to sleep. Right now, he was going over a new batch of reports from the officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking all the neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And just as Getz had suspected, the information they were getting was starting to poke holes in David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 and that at that time, Catherine was perfectly fine. But 2 different neighbors reported hearing screams coming from that apartment well before 6:40. The man who lived in the unit directly above them said he had heard 3 distinct screams at exactly 6:28. And the people who lived in the apartment right next door to them said they'd heard screaming, a dog barking, and the sound of furniture being moved around even earlier, sometime between 5:45 and 6 o'clock. Now, none of these neighbors had called the police or done anything about the noises because the sounds had stopped pretty quickly. In a crowded New York City apartment building, strange noises were a part of life. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had found the dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had insisted that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 o'clock, a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew from experience that witnesses were often unreliable when it came to specific times. And in a dense building, it was easy to get noises from different apartments confused. But still, all of these inconsistencies were adding up. It was looking more and more like David's alibi had serious problems. The detective sat back in his chair, took another sip of coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up. It was the forensics team, and they had an update on those shoe prints from the crime scene. They had confirmed that the prints on Catherine's t-shirt and on the bedsheets were indeed left by a man's shoe. They were a men's size, 10.5. This was the exact size David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room for another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer him a bottle of water. He just sat down, looked David straight in the eye, and confronted him with all the new evidence. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his size. He told him that his neighbors had heard screams coming from his apartment long before he claimed to have left the building. And he told him that Brad Stewart said he'd seen him in the hallway at least half an hour earlier than David had claimed. Getz then leaned in close and played his trump card. He told David that there were security cameras in the apartment building and that his officers were in the process of getting the footage right now. So, if David had anything to confess, he had better do it now, before the cameras proved he was lying. Getz watched as David's expression shifted from exhaustion to pure, raw fear. It seemed like this was the first time that David was truly realizing that the police did not believe his story for a second. After a moment of stunned silence, David insisted, his voice cracking, that he had not killed Catherine. He begged Getz to believe him. But when the detective just glared back at him, his face a mask of stone, David launched into a brand new story. It was a story he had not mentioned at all in the nearly 20 hours he had been interrogated. David said that Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. He said she had dated him for a while, but that David had always thought he was a creep. David said Catherine had even told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So, David said, the police really needed to go investigate Paul, not him. To Detective Getz, this sounded like a desperate, last-ditch effort from a guilty man trying to cast suspicion on someone, anyone else. But he also knew that he had to follow up on every lead, no matter how flimsy it seemed. So he wrote down Paul's name and told David they would look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room. And outside on the steps of the precinct, reporters from all the major newspapers were beginning to gather their cameras at the ready. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder was everywhere. Pictures of her smiling face were on the front page of every paper in the city. The headline on the New York Daily News made Detective Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." The article inside reported that Catherine's family back in Ohio hadn't even known she was working as a topless dancer until they flew to New York to identify her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers were determined to run with that angle. A media circus was the last thing he needed. His team was already under immense pressure to make an arrest, and now they were going to be flooded with tips from the public, most of which would be useless. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to an interrogation room. He had ended the day yesterday feeling pretty sure that David was his killer. He had finally sent David home, but with strict instructions not to leave the city. He fully intended to arrest David, and soon. But first, he had to do his due diligence. He had to follow up on the other leads he had, if only to definitively rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now, waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man David had named. Officers had tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. The man who was supposedly obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was subtly look down at Paul's shoes. He could see they were a pretty typical size, maybe a 10 or an 11. At a glance, they could easily be a 10.5. Getz also looked for any scratches or bruises on Paul's hands and arms. And he did see one small injury, a little cut on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked him about it. Paul explained calmly that his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym where he worked as a trainer. Paul was very calm, very soft-spoken. He said he had heard about Catherine's death in the news, and he was devastated. He just wanted to help the investigation in any way he could. When Getz told him that they had gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes. He said that David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they had been dating on and off ever since. He said that at the time of Catherine's death, they were in an off phase, but he still cared about her deeply and had hoped that one day they might get back together for good. Paul told Getz that he hadn't seen Catherine in person on the day she died, but he had spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon. He said this wasn't unusual. They still talked on the phone from time to time, even when they weren't officially together. Paul said he had actually tried to call her a second time later that day, but she didn't answer. He said he didn't think much of it at the time. Then Paul laid out his alibi for that night. He said he had gone shopping with some friends, and then later he went to a local bar to watch the Jets game, which started around 8:30. Getz made a note to check Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might want to kill Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes seemed to light up, as if he'd just remembered something important. He said there was this other guy, a kind of stalker named Joe. He had been one of Catherine's regular customers at the strip club. He said that months ago, this guy Joe had somehow gotten Catherine's personal phone number and had started contacting her outside of the club. Paul said that around that same time, Catherine had been drugged at work. Someone had slipped a roofie, the date rape drug, into her drink during one of her shifts. Paul said that even though he could never prove it, he had always suspected that it was Joe who had drugged her. He said Catherine had eventually cut off all contact with Joe, but the whole incident had really bothered Paul. It bothered him so much that he had tried to convince Catherine to quit her job at the club, but she had refused. Paul even admitted that he had gone so far as to call Catherine's father in Ohio to tell him how worried he was about her. He said Catherine had been furious with him for doing that and had stopped talking to him for weeks. Getz jotted all of this down. Then he asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but he was sure it was in Catherine's phone. Because he said the very last time he spoke to Catherine on the phone, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that had really surprised him. She said that after months and months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. At this, Getz studied Paul's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. This whole story about Joe could just be a clever way for Paul to deflect suspicion from himself. But Paul seemed sincere. It didn't feel like he was making it up. And besides, it would be simple enough to verify his story by checking Catherine's phone records. Detective Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of the customers from Catherine's secret life at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling deeply annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been another call from another reporter demanding an update on the case. But Getz had no updates to give. He hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. For now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he had subpoenaed the day before. And they showed that Paul Cortez had been telling the truth. The records confirmed that both Paul and a man named Joe had called Catherine shortly before she was killed. So, Getz had his officers track down Joe and bring him in for an interview. He asked Joe to explain why, after months of no contact, he had suddenly decided to call Catherine on the very day she was murdered. Joe claimed he was just calling to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He insisted he was just trying to be friendly. But then, Getz asked Joe point blank if he had ever put a roofie in anyone's drink. At this question, Joe's eyes went wide. He started to stammer and sputter, and he swore that he would never, ever dream of doing something like that. But based on Joe's panicked reaction, Getz had a strong feeling that he was lying. And so now, the entire investigation felt like it was wide open again. Just a few days ago, Getz had been absolutely certain that David Hahn was the killer. But now, all these other men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just one. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually starting to look more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers from the hotel, and they confirmed his story. They said he really had stopped to talk with them on the street on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would definitively prove David was lying about his timeline, it actually did the opposite. The footage showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38, which lined up perfectly with his story that he left around 6:40. Now, this didn't completely exonerate him. Based on what the neighbors had heard, Catherine could have been killed before he left. But there weren't many cameras in the old building, and there was no camera covering the second-floor hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another who, if anyone, had gone into that apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang again. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter. But this time, he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and he could hear the excitement in their voice. They told Getz that they had just discovered something big, something they had completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics tech explained that when they had first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was blocking the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they had done that, the mattress had accidentally covered up a crucial piece of evidence that was on the wall the whole time. It was a bloody handprint. It wasn't until a couple of days later, after they had carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they finally moved the mattress back down onto the floor. And that's when they saw it. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news. This was the break he had been waiting for. Now he thought all he had to do was go get handprints from all three of his suspects and see which one matched. It seemed like it would be that simple. But he quickly realized he had a major problem. By this point, some of his suspects had already gotten lawyers. And their lawyers were advising them not to speak with the police anymore, let alone voluntarily hand over their handprints. And Getz couldn't legally force them to give their prints unless he arrested them first. And so, Detective Getz found himself in a frustrating catch, 2-2. He needed the suspect's handprint in order to make an arrest, but he couldn't get the handprint unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation stalled. Weeks went by. Detective Getz grew more and more frustrated because there was nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. Meanwhile, the case was still getting a ton of coverage in the press. And to the public, it looked like the NYPD was just dropping the ball. But then, on December 16th, 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the very news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of a New York newspaper. And what this woman told them led Detective Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on all the forensic evidence and the numerous interviews police conducted, this is what they believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of the 27th of November, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 in the evening, the killer climbed the stairs inside Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she would be alone in the apartment, getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. The fact that she worked there, that she had this secret life, bothered the killer more than they ever let on. The thought of Catherine dancing for other men, giving her attention to other men, filled the killer with a jealous rage they could barely contain. The killer had tried to win her over, had tried to talk her into being with them exclusively, but she had rejected him. So, in the killer's mind, the time for talking was over. And so, the killer walked quietly up to the door of apartment 2D. They reached down and turned the handle. It was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer pulled out the knife that they had hidden inside their sweatshirt. But then, something they had not planned for happened. The black dog that was lying on the apartment floor jumped up and began to bark at them. For a split second, the killer thought about just turning around and leaving, abandoning the plan. But then, Catherine, alerted by the dog's barking, came out of her bedroom. She looked right at the killer, and she saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and turned and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off-limits to the killer in the past. And just the thought of that, of her trying to keep him out of her space, sent a surge of pure anger through them. The killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, trying to lift up the heavy mattress to use it as a shield. But the killer was too strong and too fast. They forced their way past the mattress and grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine was a fighter. She fought back with everything she had. She began thrashing and kicking, scratching and biting, doing anything she could to break free. But she couldn't. They struggled wildly around the small room, smashing into furniture, knocking things over. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up the knife they had brought and slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with that fatal wound, Catherine kept fighting. She fought with such viciousness that the killer actually had to brace themselves against the wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos of that struggle, the killer didn't even realize that as they steadied themselves, they had placed their bloody hand flat against the wall, leaving a perfect print behind. Finally, Catherine fell to the floor. but the killer was still blinded by rage. They got down on the floor with her and began stabbing her over and over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that the black dog that had barked at them had gotten out of the apartment during the chaos. Now, the killer wanted the dog to be back inside the apartment, but the dog was on edge, still barking at them. So instead, the killer just pulled the apartment door shut, trapping the dog out in the hallway. And then the killer fled the building, using a back door where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught, until their violent past finally came back to haunt them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who had no connection to Catherine at all was walking down a street in New York City when she glanced over at a newsstand. And on the cover of one of the newspapers, a picture was plastered across the front page. It was a picture of a man who was currently a person of interest in a high-profile murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this man, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had been too scared and ashamed to ever file a police report. But now, seeing his face in the paper, seeing that this horrible person was being investigated for murder, she knew she had to speak up. She called the NYPD and she told them everything she knew. The NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's brave testimony as the basis to arrest the killer for the previous assault. And finally, once he was under arrest, Detective Getz was legally able to get his handprint. And those prints were a perfect match to the bloody handprint found on Catherine's bedroom wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions about Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep, a violent predator who had assaulted at least one other woman before he murdered Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell phone towers would later prove that Paul was in the immediate vicinity of Catherine's apartment building right before her murder. The records also showed he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited. He watched until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car. And then he hustled upstairs, knowing that Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for about 20 minutes, it was more than enough time for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine in a jealous rage, and slip away completely unnoticed. Paul Cortez was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, the 23rd of December, 2005. He was later found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. And just like that, the truth finally came to light. But the haunting question remains, how many stories like this are still unresolved, hidden from view? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're not ready to stop here, there's still so much waiting for you in the next episode. See you next time. On the morning of Tuesday, the 13th of July, 1993, a nurse named Sharon Dempsey was making her way down a long hallway at the Mahiri Hubbard Hospital in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. She moved with a purpose, her steps quick and efficient as she checked in on her patients. But on this particular morning, she was also on a mission. She was searching for one patient who had a habit of wandering away from her room. As Sharon reached the end of the hallway, she peered into the last room and let out a small sigh of relief. There, inside, was the woman she had been looking for. Her name was Mildred Lancaster. She was 69 years old, and at that moment, she was busy sweeping the floor of another patient's room. She was using a broom that Sharon recognized immediately, one that Mildred had likely swiped from a custodian's cart she'd found in the hallway. Sharon walked into the room and gently approached the older woman. She asked her, "Mildred, what are you doing here?" Mildred turned, a look of simple purpose on her face, and she replied that she was just doing her job. But of course, this wasn't her job. Mildred wasn't an employee of the hospital. She was a patient. She had been admitted just 2 days earlier, suffering from severe stomach pain. But that wasn't her only issue. Mildred also experienced extreme bouts of confusion, which was exactly what Sharon was witnessing right now. The nurse had to hide a small, weary smile. This had become a familiar routine. Mildred's family had explained her history to the hospital staff when she was admitted. For most of her life, Mildred had worked as a housekeeper. It was a job she took pride in, a role that had defined her for decades. And so now, when her mind would get clouded with confusion, she would often revert back to that familiar identity. She would think she was at work, even when she was at home, or in this case, in a hospital bed. Her family had seen it many times. She would suddenly get up and start tidying things, convinced she was on the clock. Because of this behavior, the hospital staff had considered using physical restraints to keep Mildred safely in her room. The fear was that she might wander into a restricted area or hurt herself. But Mildred was such a sweet and gentle soul. The idea of tying her down just felt wrong to everyone involved. So, the medical team decided on a different approach. They would have to accept that from time to time, Mildred was going to believe she was a housekeeper again. She would likely leave her room and go looking for something to clean. The plan was simple. Keep a very close eye on her, make sure she was safe, and continue to treat her stomach pain while managing her disorientation. So, in this moment, finding Mildred with a broom in her hand, Sharon just followed that protocol. She spoke to her in a calm, gentle voice and said, "Okay, Mildred, you can put the broom down now. Come with me." Mildred, ever agreeable, listened. She set the broom against the wall, and Sharon gently led her by the arm, walking her back down the hall to her own room. After making sure Mildred was settled, Sharon continued with her rounds, the small incident already fading from her mind. A couple of days went by. Sharon was once again doing her regular rounds, moving from room to room, checking charts, and speaking with patients. When she arrived at Mildred's room, she pushed the door open and saw that it was empty. The bed was neatly made, but Mildred was nowhere in sight. At first, Sharon just felt a wave of annoyance. By this point, Mildred had wandered off so many times that it was becoming a bit of a hassle. It wasn't alarming anymore, just another small task to add to her already busy day. Sharon followed the usual procedure. She left the room and began walking the floor, checking other patient rooms, utility closets, and common areas, expecting to find Mildred tidying up some corner of the hospital. But this time was different. After a full sweep of the entire floor, there was no sign of her. Sharon went back and started her search again, this time being much more thorough. She looked in every supply closet, every empty room, every nook and cranny she could think of. Still nothing. That's when the annoyance started to curdle into real concern, a knot of panic tightening in her stomach. She started approaching other nurses and doctors, her voice a little more urgent now. She asked them, "Have you seen Mildred Lancaster?" By now, most of the staff on the floor knew about Mildred and her habit of wandering, but no one had seen her. Not a single person. Realizing this was now a serious situation, Sharon went to her superiors and informed them that one of her patients was missing. Immediately, the hospital launched a full-scale search. Security personnel and staff members fanned out across the entire building, a sprawling 11-story complex. They searched inside and out, checking every floor, every wing, every possible hiding place. Sharon tried to help, walking around and telling the search teams where Mildred might be likely to go. She told them to focus on areas that looked messy or disorganized. She explained that when Mildred got confused, her instinct was to find clutter and clean it up. So people started checking storage rooms, renovation areas, and anywhere else that might have looked untidy to Mildred. But the hospital was massive. There were countless messy areas, and the task of searching them all felt overwhelming. To make matters worse, the hospital had no security cameras. They couldn't just rewind some footage to see if Mildred had walked out one of the doors. There was no digital trail to follow. After an hour of frantic searching, they had found nothing. The hope of finding her quickly was beginning to fade, and people started to wonder if they would find her at all. It was at this point that the situation took a strange and concerning new turn. As part of her duty, Sharon called Mildred's cousin to let the family know what was happening. She explained that Mildred was missing, and that this time, it was serious. But as Sharon was breaking the news, the cousin stopped her. She said, "Wait a minute. I think I know what's going on." It turned out that a few hours earlier, the cousin had actually come to the hospital to visit Mildred. When she arrived and spoke to the receptionist at the front desk, she asked for Mildred's room number. The receptionist looked up the name in the system and then gave the cousin some surprising news. The computer showed that Mildred Lancaster had been officially checked out of the hospital that very morning. This new information completely changed the situation. The massive search was pointless if Mildred wasn't even in the building. But to Sharon, it made absolutely no sense. Mildred was in no condition to be discharged. She was still sick, still suffering from stomach pain, and her confusion was as bad as ever. There was no way a doctor would have signed off on her release. Yet, the cousin was certain. The receptionist had told her Mildred was gone, so the cousin had turned around and left without ever going upstairs. Sharon hung up the phone, her mind racing. She quickly walked down to the main lobby to talk to the receptionist herself. She asked the woman to look up Mildred's file, and sure enough, the system confirmed it. Mildred Lancaster had been discharged. Sharon stood there, stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could this have happened? Who would have authorized it? Not knowing what to do next, she walked away from the desk and went over to a large window that overlooked the busy streets in front of the hospital. She just stood there, watching the cars speed by, trying to process this bizarre turn of events. And then, a horrible thought entered her mind. What if Mildred, in her confused state, had somehow managed to wander down to the front desk and convince someone to discharge her? What if she had then walked out the front doors and was now wandering aimlessly through the city? She could have been hit by a car. She could be hurt, lying somewhere, unable to call for help. The situation had suddenly become a true emergency. Sharon knew what she had to do. She had to call the police. Not long after, police officers arrived at the hospital and they brought search dogs with them. Almost immediately, one of the dogs picked up Mildred's scent right by one of the main front doors. The dog then led its handler down the sidewalk and along the street, which seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. Mildred really had left the hospital and wandered off. The police launched a massive search of the surrounding area. Officers canvassed a full square mile around the hospital, and a helicopter was brought in to scan the area from above. The search for Mildred went on for days, but it was fruitless. There was no sign of her anywhere. She had vanished without a trace. Then, almost 2 weeks later, the search came to a tragic end. On Wednesday, July 28th, 13 days after Mildred had disappeared, a security guard was doing his daily patrol through a construction site. As he walked along the edge of the site, he noticed a long, thin hole in the ground. It was about 5 feet deep, a trench that had been dug to lay some new pipework. The guard probably wouldn't have given it a second thought, but for some reason, he decided to walk over and look down into it. As he peered into the darkness, he gasped. Down at the bottom of the trench, he saw Mildred. It turns out, on the day she disappeared, Mildred had indeed become confused. She believed she was a housekeeper again, and she had left her room to go find some work to do. She began wandering through the hospital, moving from floor to floor. Surprisingly, nobody stopped her. She was such a pleasant and gentle woman that people who saw her probably just smiled and assumed she knew where she was going. After wandering for quite a while, going up and down different flights of stairs, she eventually found her way to the construction site. But to her confused mind, it wasn't a construction site. It was just a terribly messy area that was in desperate need of a good cleaning. There were pieces of wood, scraps of plastic, and debris scattered everywhere. So, Mildred got to work. She spent some time tidying the area, picking up debris, and trying to make things orderly. As she worked her way towards the back of the site, she failed to see the deep, narrow trench in the ground. She took a step and fell inside. Because she was so disoriented, she likely didn't even understand what had happened. She wouldn't have realized she had fallen into a hole and needed to climb out. In that dark, confined space, her confusion would have only deepened. She may not have even tried to escape. And so, she remained in that hole, undetected, for 13 days, until she eventually passed away. But perhaps the most tragic part of this entire story is that Mildred had never actually left the hospital. The construction site where she was found was located on the 10th floor of the hospital. That entire floor was being renovated, and she had simply meandered her way up there. All of those search parties, all of those police officers, they had all been looking for her outside. Even the teams that searched inside the hospital had been to that construction site. They had walked right past the very hole where she was lying. But they hadn't thought to look down into it. And Mildred, assuming she was still alive when they were nearby, was too confused and disoriented to call out for help. She just stayed quiet in that hole, and so she was never found in time. To this day, it's still not known why her hospital records showed that she had been discharged. Some believe it was a simple clerical error, a mistaken entry in the system. Others think it might have been a computer glitch. And the police dog that picked up her scent and led the search away from the hospital, that also remains an unexplained anomaly. Mildred's family later sued the hospital for $13 million in damages, but for reasons that were never made public, they eventually dropped the case. On the night of the 12th of January 1964, a police sergeant named Neil Johnson stepped into a small apartment in Los Angeles County, California. He was followed by a team of other officers, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, they were hit by two things at once: a blast of intense dry heat and a truly terrible smell. It was the smell of decomposition, and it didn't take them long to find the source. There, on the living room couch, was the body of a man. He was clearly deceased and had been for some time. Sergeant Johnson and his team had been called to the apartment by the building's landlord. Other tenants had been complaining for days about a foul odor coming from this specific unit, and the landlord had finally called the police to investigate. Based on the information the landlord had already provided, the police had a good idea of who the man on the couch was. The apartment was rented to a 8-year-old man named Eugene Meadows. Eugene was new to the building. In fact, he had only moved in 6 days earlier. He was also new to the area, having relocated from about 8 hours away to start a new job. This meant it was very likely he didn't know many people in town yet. Sergeant Johnson and a few other officers moved closer to the couch to get a better look at the body. Right away, two things became apparent. First, it was clear that Eugene had not died recently. Based on the state of his body, he had probably been dead for at least a couple of days. And second, there was a very distinct hole in the back of his head. It looked for all the world like a bullet wound. But as Sergeant Johnson began to survey the rest of the apartment, he realized that the bullet hole didn't make any sense. For starters, the entire apartment was incredibly neat and clean. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication of a robbery or a break-in. Everything was in its place. The landlord had also told the police something crucial. When he had first come to check on the apartment after the smell complaints, he had found the front door locked from the inside. He also checked and found that all of the windows were closed and securely locked as well. This presented a major problem for the murder theory. If Eugene had been shot, the killer would have had to lock the door from the outside as they left. This would mean they had a key. It was possible they took it from Eugene, but given that he was so new to the area, it seemed unlikely he had given a key to anyone. The alternative theory, that Eugene had taken his own life, seemed even less plausible. The biggest problem with that idea was the complete absence of a gun. If he had shot himself, the weapon should have been somewhere nearby, on the couch, or on the floor next to him. But it wasn't. The officers conducted a thorough search of the entire apartment, looking in every drawer, closet, and cabinet. There was no gun to be found. Sergeant Johnson and his team were completely baffled. It was a classic locked room mystery. The scene didn't point to murder, and it didn't point to suicide. It just didn't make any sense at all. Rather than speculate further at the scene, they had Eugene's body transported to the local coroner's office for an autopsy. They hoped that a medical examination would provide the answers they so desperately needed. However, when the coroner examined Eugene's body, the case only became stranger. The first and most shocking discovery was that the coroner could not find a bullet anywhere inside of Eugene's head or his body. There was also no exit wound. Typically, when someone is shot, the bullet either remains lodged inside the body or it passes all the way through, creating a second hole. Eugene had one hole in the back of his head, no exit wound, and absolutely no bullet. It was a physical impossibility. In addition to this major anomaly, the coroner noted two other strange details. The first was that Eugene had something called a calcium ridge on the back of his skull near the location of the hole. This is a harmless genetic trait, where a small section of the skull is harder but also more brittle than the surrounding bone. It was something he would have been born with and likely never knew he had. But, given its proximity to the wound, the coroner made a special note of it. The second strange finding was the color of Eugene's internal organs. When the coroner examined his abdomen, he saw that the organs were a bright, vibrant cherry red. At first, the coroner wasn't sure if this was significant. It was unusual, but it didn't immediately point to a cause of death. But as he continued to puzzle over the case, unable to make sense of how Eugene had died or how he got the hole in his head, his mind kept coming back to those red organs. Suddenly, he had an idea, a theory that was wild but might just explain everything. He contacted the police and asked Sergeant Johnson to go back to Eugene's apartment and check for one very specific thing. He told him that if it was there, the entire mystery would be solved. Sure enough, Sergeant Johnson and his team returned to the apartment. They followed the coroner's instructions, and they found exactly what he had suspected would be there. And just like he'd said, it explained everything. It turned out that what happened to Eugene was not a murder, nor was it a suicide. In fact, there had been no shooting at all. The coroner's suspicion, sparked by the sight of those bright red organs, was that Eugene had died from carbon monoxide poisoning. This type of poisoning is known to cause a victim's internal organs to turn that distinctive cherry red color. When the police went back to the apartment, they discovered that the building's heater was old and faulty. It was leaking, and it had been slowly filling Eugene's small, sealed apartment with poisonous carbon monoxide gas. The mystery of how Eugene died was finally solved. But that still left the question of the hole in his head. The explanation for that was even more bizarre. After Eugene had passed out on his couch from the gas, the carbon monoxide continued to build up in his system. One of the effects of severe poisoning is that it can cause the brain to swell dramatically. As Eugene's brain began to expand inside his skull, it pushed against the bone. And because he had that unique calcium ridge on the back of his head, that area of his skull that was harder but also more brittle, the pressure had to go somewhere. As his brain continued to swell, the immense pressure eventually caused that brittle section of his skull to shatter. His brain essentially blew out a small portion of the back of his head, creating a wound that looked exactly like a gunshot hole to the naked eye. It was a tragic, one-in-a-million accident that had created the illusion of a violent crime. One afternoon in the spring of 1998, a 64-year-old man named Klaus Schmidt was walking through the international terminal of the Dublin airport in Ireland. As he made his way through the bustling crowds, he was gripped by a powerful and unsettling feeling of nervousness. He couldn't shake the idea that getting on his flight that day was a very, very bad idea. When he finally spotted his gate at the far end of the terminal, that vague nervousness intensified into a sense of genuine dread that washed over him completely. Now, Klaus was generally an anxious flyer. He never enjoyed the experience, but this was different. He had never felt this kind of deep existential fear before boarding a plane. This was a new and terrifying feeling. When he reached his gate, he saw the other passengers lining up, showing their tickets, and walking down the jet bridge. The sight of them boarding the plane almost triggered a full-blown panic attack. He stood, frozen for a moment, his mind screaming at him to turn around. A voice in his head told him to just listen to his gut, to not get on this plane. He could just go back to the ticket counter, book a flight for the next day, and this horrible feeling would go away. But as he stood there, paralyzed by fear, the logical side of his brain began to fight back. He told himself that he was just being ridiculous. He was a nervous flyer, and his anxiety was getting the better of him. There was nothing to be worried about. The flight would be short, and it would be over before he knew it. He was just overreacting. So, even though he couldn't completely shake the feeling of dread that was now a tight knot in his stomach, he decided to override his instincts. He took a deep breath, walked up to the gate, had his ticket scanned, and forced himself to board the flight. About an hour later, the plane had taken off and was cruising high above the Irish Sea. Klaus was in a window seat. He cautiously raised the plastic shade and looked out. The sky was clear, the water below was calm and beautiful. He glanced around the cabin at the other passengers. People were reading, chatting quietly, or dozing. Everyone seemed perfectly relaxed. There was absolutely no reason to think anything was wrong. But still, Klaus could not get rid of that awful feeling. He just wanted the plane to land, for this whole ordeal to be over. He knew he couldn't make the plane go any faster, so he tried to do some breathing exercises to calm his racing heart. He breathed in slowly, held it, and then breathed out. At first, it seemed to be working. His anxiety began to ebb just a little. But over the next 10 or 15 minutes, something new started to happen. Klaus started to feel like he was having a hard time breathing. It felt as if the air was getting thin. He discreetly looked around the cabin again, trying to see if anyone else was struggling, if maybe there was a problem with the cabin pressure. But everyone else still looked completely fine. It was just him. The difficulty breathing grew worse, and he started to sweat. He was rocking back and forth in his seat now, consumed by an anxiety he couldn't control. Then, a new symptom appeared. He started to feel an intense tightness in his chest, a crushing pressure that was both painful and terrifying. His first thought was that he was having the worst panic attack of his life. His anxiety had finally spiraled completely out of control. He fumbled to take off his jacket, unbuttoning the top of his shirt, hoping to get some relief. He was now dripping with sweat, and the passengers sitting near him were starting to notice. They were giving him concerned looks, but no one had said anything yet. Klaus tried to tell himself to stay calm, but it was impossible. The tightness in his chest got so bad, so intense, that he realized this probably wasn't just anxiety. This felt like something much more serious. This felt like a heart attack. The moment that realization hit him, it was as if all of his symptoms became 10 times worse. The pain in his chest was unbearable, and he felt his consciousness begin to fade. The world around him started to go dim. He could hear the muffled sounds of other passengers near him yelling for help. He heard a flight attendant rush over and her voice calling out urgently to the rest of the plane, asking if there were any doctors on board. As Klaus drifted further and further into unconsciousness, his last coherent thought was that his intuition had been right all along. Something terrible was going to happen to him on this plane. And before he could think anything more, his vision went completely blurry and he faded into total darkness. But it would turn out that Klaus's powerful intuition was actually only half right. While it was true that something terrible did happen to him on that flight, he really did suffer a massive heart attack. It was his decision to ignore that intuition and get on the plane that actually saved his life. Because this particular flight, by an incredible stroke of luck, was carrying 40 of the world's leading heart specialists. They were all flying home from an international cardiology conference. And it gets even more unbelievable. They just happened to be carrying samples with them of a brand new experimental heart drug, one that was not yet available to the general public. So when Klaus collapsed and the flight attendant called out for a doctor, not one but 40 doctors all raised their hands. One of them rushed over to Klaus's side, quickly diagnosed the heart attack, and immediately administered the new life-saving medication. Against all odds, the very flight he was terrified to board was the only place on Earth that could have saved him at that exact moment. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the evening of the 28th of April 2002, 38-year-old Rhonda Boggs was sitting on the couch in her mother-in-law's house in the small, quiet city of Pascala, Ohio. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall, a nervous energy building inside of her. At her feet, her 2.5-year-old daughter, Amanda, was happily playing with a little stuffed animal, completely unaware of her mother's anxiety. It was 6:30 in the evening, and Rhonda's husband, Dave, was scheduled to call any minute. But he wasn't calling from work or from a friend's house. Dave was calling from the county jail, where he was currently incarcerated. He had been sentenced to 2 weeks behind bars, not for anything violent, but for something that to Rhonda felt just as damaging to their family. He had failed to pay child support to one of his ex-girlfriends. And while Rhonda was deeply upset and embarrassed by the whole situation, a part of her knew she really shouldn't have been surprised. This was just who Dave was. When Rhonda had first met Dave about 12 years earlier, she had been completely swept away by his carefree, rebellious personality. He was the lead singer in a local rock band, and she had fallen in love with him while watching him on stage, dancing in the front row at his shows. Back then, it all felt so glamorous and exciting, like a fantasy. It felt like they were going to stay young and wild forever. But now, reality had set in hard. They were both 38 years old, they had a toddler to raise, and a mountain of bills to pay. But Dave, it seemed, just kept on partying and playing the part of a rock star, while all the real-world responsibilities fell squarely on Rhonda's shoulders. She could barely remember the last time she'd gone to one of his shows since Amanda was born. In part, it was because a smoky, loud bar was no place for a baby. But it was also because the crowd Dave hung around with was not the kind of crowd she wanted to be a part of anymore. They were hard drinkers, some were into drugs, and more than a few were ex-convicts. And so now, after almost 4 years of marriage, Rhonda was finally starting to see Dave not as carefree, but as just plain reckless. The phone on the end table finally rang, jolting her from her thoughts. Rhonda picked it up. As she expected, it was Dave on the other end. What she really wanted to say, what was bubbling up inside her, was that she was angry, that she was tired, and that she was seriously considering filing for divorce. In fact, she had already taken a major step. She'd gone through her paperwork and quietly taken his name off of her retirement plan. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt significant. It was her preparing for a future without him. But she couldn't say any of that right now. She could see her mother-in-law standing in the doorway, pretending to be busy, but clearly listening in on the conversation. And so, instead of saying what she really felt, Rhonda just put on a brave face and said, "Hey Dave, how are you doing?" An hour later, Rhonda was back at her own home. She placed a casserole into the oven to heat up for dinner. Then, she turned on the cartoons for Amanda to keep her occupied and went outside. It was getting dark, but she was determined to mow the lawn. Rhonda was used to doing almost everything around the house by herself. Dave was practically never home anyway, between his band practice and his nights out with friends. But now that he was actually in jail, she had to do literally everything. That included wrestling with their old, unreliable lawnmower on a Sunday night. She wheeled the machine out of the garage and into the yard and gave the cord a hard pull to start the engine. The mower sputtered to life for a moment, then died. She tried again. It roared for a few seconds, then cut out again. As she was struggling with it, she noticed her neighbor coming out of his house across the street. He gave her a friendly wave as he walked down his driveway. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted for her to turn off the mower. Once she did, and the yard was quiet again, he called out, asking if she wanted to borrow his lawnmower, which he assured her actually worked. Rhonda looked around at the tall grass, then at the sky, which was getting darker by the minute. She glanced at her watch and realized her casserole would be done any second. She really appreciated the offer, but she just didn't have the time or the energy for it anymore. She shouted back that it was okay, she had to go back inside anyway. She said goodbye to her neighbor, pushed the defective lawnmower back into the garage, and made a mental note to call Dave's cousin, Nick, the next day. She figured maybe he could come by and fix it for her. Nick worked as a maintenance man at a big apartment complex and lived about 45 minutes away, but he'd been a huge help to Rhonda while Dave was in jail. Just last week, he had come over and fixed her washing machine. He was always calling to check in on her and Amanda, and she was grateful for his help. Back inside, Rhonda went straight to the kitchen and took the casserole out of the oven just as the timer was about to go off. She cut it into two pieces, one for her and a smaller one for Amanda, and brought the plates into the dining room. After setting them on the table, she walked over, turned off the television, scooped up her daughter from the living room floor, and carried her over to her high chair. It was getting late, and all Rhonda really wanted to do was eat quickly, clean up, and go to bed. But dinner with a toddler was never that simple. For every spoonful of food that made it into Amanda's mouth, it seemed another one wound up on the floor. Rhonda knew she was facing another round of cleanup before she could finally get some rest. But she also knew Amanda couldn't help it. She was just a little kid. So Rhonda reached over, took her daughter's fork, and started helping her eat, trying to minimize the mess and speed things up. In moments like these, Rhonda knew that Amanda was the one thing, the only thing, preventing her from just pulling the trigger on a divorce. She didn't know if she could handle being a single mother. It was hard enough having Dave gone for just a few weeks. She couldn't imagine doing this all by herself forever. And since she already had proof that Dave was bad at paying child support, the very reason he was in jail right now, she figured that even if a judge ordered him to pay her, she'd likely end up having to pay all the bills herself anyway. She would need to work full-time. Rhonda did have a job as an office assistant, but she wasn't sure if that salary would be enough to fully support herself and her daughter without any help. But just as she was scooping up another bite of casserole for Amanda, she heard a noise from outside. It sounded like heavy, hurried footsteps. She turned and looked towards the front window. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the dark silhouette of a person coming quickly up her driveway. The next morning, Monday, April 29th, a man named Gary Pulowski was at his desk at Hamilton Home Products, a heating equipment company just outside of Columbus. He noticed that his coworker, Rhonda Boggs, was running late for her shift. This was more than just unusual. It was unheard of. In all the time Rhonda had worked there, she had never once been late. Gary started asking around the office to see if anyone had heard from her, if maybe she had called in sick. But his coworkers all shook their heads. No one had heard from her since she left the office on Friday evening. Gary went back to his desk and tried calling Rhonda's landline at her house. It rang and rang, but no one picked up. He tried a few more times over the next hour, but still got no answer. He waited, hoping she might call back, but the phone on his desk remained silent. A knot of worry began to form in his stomach. He started to think that maybe she'd had car trouble. He knew it was about a 15-mile drive from her house in Pascala to the office, and back in 2002, not everyone had a cell phone. He didn't know if Rhonda did. If her car had broken down, she could be stranded on the side of the road with no way to call for help. And so, Gary made a decision. He told his boss he was going to check on her, got in his own car, and started driving the route from the office back towards Rhonda's house, hoping to spot her car on the shoulder. Gary drove the entire way to Pascala, his eyes peeled, scanning both sides of the road for any sign of Rhonda or her car, but he saw nothing. It wasn't until he finally turned the corner onto Rhonda's street that he saw her car. It was parked right in her driveway next to her small, white-paneled one-story house. At that moment, Gary's worry turned into a deep sense of dread. If her car was here, it meant Rhonda had never even left for work. And he knew with a chilling certainty that if she had stayed home this whole time without calling him or anyone else, something had to be very wrong. He pulled his car up to the curb, got out, and walked up the concrete path to the front door. He knocked, waited, then knocked again, louder this time. There was no answer. He walked around the side of the house to the back door and knocked there too. Still nothing but silence. He walked back around to the front of the house, feeling defeated, unsure of what to do next. He was about to leave and maybe call the police when he saw a flicker of movement in one of the front windows. The drapes were rustling. He squinted, trying to see what was causing it, and then his heart sank. He saw the small face of Rhonda's toddler daughter, Amanda, peering out at him. Her little face was red and splotchy, as if she had been crying for a very long time. Now, Gary started to panic, but he fought to keep his voice calm. He ran over to the window and shouted through the glass, telling Amanda that he was a friend of her mommy's. He tried to convince her to go to the front door and open it so he could come in and help her. It took a minute for the little girl to understand what he was asking, but eventually she seemed to get it. She disappeared from the window. A moment later, Gary heard the faint click of the lock on the front door, and it slowly creaked open. He rushed over and stepped inside. The first thing he saw stopped him cold. There were bloody footprints tracked across the living room carpet. Without a second thought, Gary instinctively scooped Amanda up into his arms, turned around, and ran out of the house. He sprinted across the street, pounded on the neighbor's door, and when they opened it, he yelled at them to call the police immediately. Not long after, officers from the Pascala Police Department arrived. This was the first homicide in their small town in 6 years. The entire police department only had 17 officers, and their crime scene unit was run out of a refurbished ambulance. Police Chief Chris Forci knew he didn't have a ton of resources to throw at this case, but he called in every available officer and sent them to the crime scene. Then he headed out there himself to make sure everything was done by the book. By the time Forci arrived at the house, his officers had already secured the perimeter with yellow tape. He ducked under the tape, walked inside, and followed the sounds of footsteps and the clicking of cameras into the kitchen. There, on the tile floor, a woman was lying in a large pool of blood. An officer informed Forci that the victim had been identified as Rhonda Boggs. He explained that it was her co-worker who had come to check on her that morning and had found her daughter alone in the house, which led to the 911 call. The officer also told him that Rhonda's toddler had been found physically uninjured. Forci knelt down to examine the body. Right away, he could see more than a dozen stab wounds on her head, her neck, her chest, and her shoulders. The sheer number of wounds and the amount of blood spatter all over the kitchen told him there had been a violent struggle. It looked like Rhonda had fought back against her attacker, and fought hard. The remnants of a casserole were sitting on the stove, and Rhonda was still fully dressed. Forci figured the attack must have happened sometime after dinner, but before she had gone to bed. He couldn't help but wonder if her poor little girl had been awake, or maybe even in the room when it happened. After the crime scene photographers had documented everything, Forci gave the coroner's staff the go-ahead to move the body. As they carefully lifted Rhonda's body from the floor and placed it onto a stretcher, Forci noticed something lying on the tile beneath where she had been. It was a steak knife, its blade covered in dried blood. He looked over at the kitchen counter and saw a knife block. The black handle on the murder weapon was a perfect match to the set of knives on the counter. It appeared Rhonda had been killed with a knife from her own kitchen. This was a significant detail. It meant her killer probably hadn't brought a weapon with them, which suggested this was a spontaneous, heat-of-the-moment crime rather than something that had been meticulously planned out. While his officers finished collecting forensic evidence in the kitchen, Forci walked through the rest of the small house. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. In the bedroom, a jewelry box on the dresser was open and empty. The dresser drawers were pulled out, with piles of Rhonda's clothes thrown all over the floor. In the dining room, he found a purse that had been turned upside down, its contents spilled out across the table. It was clear that someone had been frantically searching through it. With the ransacked appearance of the house and the weapon of opportunity, Forci's initial theory was that this was a robbery that had gone horribly wrong. But there was one detail that didn't quite fit. There was no sign of a forced entry anywhere. No broken windows, no pried open doors. Just then, Forci heard a commotion near the front of the house. He walked over and saw a woman trying to push her way past his officers and into the home. Her face was red, she was sobbing uncontrollably, and she was shouting, demanding to know what had happened. Forci gently took the woman outside and tried to calm her down. She eventually told him that her name was Kim Davis, and she was Rhonda's sister. Once Kim had caught her breath, Forci had the difficult task of explaining what he knew so far. He told her that her sister had been found stabbed to death inside the house. He mentioned his running theory that it might have been a robbery, but he also pointed out that the lack of forced entry could mean that Rhonda knew her attacker, that she might have willingly let them into the house. Kim was obviously devastated by this news, and for a minute, Forchi just tried to console her. But he knew he had to press on with the investigation. Once she had calmed down a little, he asked her if she could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Rhonda. Kim immediately shook her head. She couldn't imagine her sister having any enemies at all. But after thinking about it for a moment, she said that actually there was one person who had a problem with Rhonda, and that was her own husband, Dave. Kim told the chief that Rhonda and Dave's marriage had been falling apart for a while. In fact, Rhonda had recently confided in her that she was thinking about getting a divorce. But then Kim added that Dave was currently in jail, so she didn't see how he could have possibly done this himself. Still, she thought it was possible that he could have been involved somehow. Maybe he had paid someone to do it, or convinced one of his shady friends to do it for him. Forchi promised Kim he would look into it, but he was already feeling skeptical. If Dave couldn't even afford to pay his child support, what were the chances he could afford to hire a hitman? And the murder weapon, coming from Rhonda's own kitchen, didn't fit with the idea of a planned assassination. At this point, Forchi believed their best chance to figure out what really happened was to speak with the only other known person at the scene of the crime, Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, Amanda. Later that day, a social worker from Child Services arrived at the house. Forchi met her outside and explained that before she took custody of Amanda, he was hoping she could help him. He needed her to try to talk to the little girl and see if she could tell them anything about the murder. The social worker agreed. Forchi took her across the street to the neighbor's house where Amanda had been staying all morning. Forchi knew it was a long shot. The little girl could be in shock, and at 2 years old, her memory and ability to communicate would be limited. He also knew that anything she did say might not be reliable. But he had to try. He stood quietly in the corner of the living room while the social worker sat down on the floor with Amanda. She gently asked the little girl what she had seen the night before. To Forchi's astonishment, Amanda looked up at the social worker and jerked her small hand toward her own neck, in a gesture that looked chillingly like a stabbing motion. Then, in a tiny, quiet voice, she said her mother had fallen down and gone to sleep. The social worker then asked her if anyone else had been there. Forchi found himself holding his breath, waiting for her answer. After a moment of silence, Amanda spoke a single name. She said, "Uncle Nick." A few hours later, Chief Forchi was still at the crime scene when a cruiser pulled up. 2 of his officers got out, pulled a grungy-looking man out of the back seat, and escorted him into the house. But this was not the Uncle Nick that Amanda had named. It was her father, Dave Boggs, who had been in jail when his wife was murdered. Forchi was absolutely planning to find and speak with this Uncle Nick, but first he wanted to gather as much information about him as he could. Amanda had said repeatedly that Uncle Nick had hurt her mommy. But as definitive as a 2-year-old could sound, Forchi knew he needed an adult's perspective before he made any moves. A judge had granted Dave an early release from jail because of the tragedy. Forchi had made sure Dave was brought directly to the crime scene so he could question him before Dave had a chance to talk to anyone else and potentially contaminate his memory. Forchi met Dave and the officers at the door and led them into the living room, sitting Dave down on the couch. They briefly filled him in on what had happened to his wife. But before he could fully process the shock, they told him they needed him to do a walkthrough of the house to help them identify what might have been stolen. But first, Forchi said he had a very important question. He looked at Dave and asked, "Who is Uncle Nick?" At this, Dave, who until that point had just looked completely shell-shocked, now looked confused. He told Forchi that Uncle Nick was the name his daughter used for his second cousin. His real name was Richard Nicholas Robinson, but everyone just called him Nick. He explained that Nick had been helping Rhonda out with things around the house while he was in jail. He said Nick had probably been over at the house almost every day, fixing one thing or another. But Dave said he couldn't understand why Forchi was asking about him. He insisted there was no way Nick would ever hurt Rhonda. He said Nick really looked out for her and for Amanda. Forchi didn't explain why he was asking. The information was enough. He went outside, got on his police radio, and broadcast a bulletin to all police departments in the area to be on the lookout for a man named Nick Robinson. Less than an hour later, a patrol car spotted Nick Robinson's SUV on State Route 37 just outside of Pataskala. They pulled him over. The officers ordered him out of the vehicle at gunpoint. As soon as he was out, they rolled to the ground, put a gun to the back of his head, and cuffed him. While they were cuffing him, they noticed a dark spot on his baseball cap that looked suspiciously like a bloodstain. As they placed him in the back of the cruiser, he kept asking what was going on, but the officers didn't answer him. Instead, they began to search his SUV. In the back, they found pieces of cardboard laid out, and on the cardboard were reddish-brown smears that also appeared to be blood. When the officers got back into their cruiser, Nick looked at them and asked, "Is this about Rhonda?" By the time the arrest was made, Chief Forchie was at Nick Robinson's house, questioning his wife, Debbie. So, he dispatched one of his best and only detectives, a man named Bruce Brooks, to go down to the police headquarters and handle Nick's interrogation. When Detective Brooks walked into the small interview room, he immediately saw that Nick, who was sitting at the table with his head in his hands, looked pale and sick. Brooks asked him if he was okay. Nick said he was just hungover from a long night of drinking. He laid out his alibi. He said he had been at a bar called Merry Melody in Columbus until around 10:30 the previous night. Then he had driven to another bar in Lancaster, a town near where he lived, called the Fairview Inn. He said he finally got home around 1:30 in the morning and passed out on his couch. Nick swore up and down that he didn't know anything about what had happened to Rhonda and that he only found out she was dead when he saw it on the news that day. As for the blood police found in his SUV and on his hat, he claimed it was just animal blood from a recent hunting trip. But Detective Brooks was not buying any of it. He had heard the 2-year-old girl, Amanda, say, "Uncle Nick hurts Mom." And while he knew a toddler's testimony was not something you could build an entire case on, the way she had said it and the stabbing gesture she had made at her own neck was incredibly compelling, especially since Rhonda had been found stabbed to death. So Brooks pushed back at Nick. He said if Nick's alibi was that he was too drunk to have committed the murder, then how could he be so sure he hadn't done it? If he was drunk enough to have gaps in his memory, then it was just as likely that he could have killed Rhonda in an alcohol-fueled blackout. But Nick just shook his head and kept saying no. No seemed to be his answer for every question Brooks asked him. As the hours ticked by, the detective grew more and more frustrated with the constant denials. Finally, he decided to play his trump card. He told Nick that Rhonda's daughter had seen the whole thing. He painted a vivid picture for him, telling him to imagine that little girl on a witness stand in a courtroom with some defense lawyer poking and prodding her, forcing her to relive the most traumatic event of her entire life, the murder of her own mother. When he said that, a visible crack appeared in Nick's wall of denial. It was clear the image deeply disturbed him. Finally, a little after midnight, after 6 straight hours of interrogation, Nick agreed to take a lie detector test. When the results came back, the machine indicated that Nick was being deceptive. He had failed. But even then, instead of confessing, Nick dug in his heels and swore that he was innocent. So Brooks pulled out the last and most serious threat he could think of. He told Nick that if he didn't confess right then and there, he could be facing the death penalty. At that, Nick visibly cracked. The threat of execution seemed to shatter his resolve. After a long, heavy silence, Nick finally said that maybe, just maybe, he did have something to do with what happened, but he just couldn't remember it. From that point on, Brooks kept pushing and pushing relentlessly. Around 5 in the morning, Nick finally broke down completely and confessed to the murder. He said he had gone to Rhonda's house in between his visits to the 2 bars. He claimed he had tried to kiss her, but she had pulled away and grabbed a knife. He said that when he tried to take the knife away from her, he accidentally stabbed her. As the sun came up, officers drove Nick to the Licking County Jail and officially booked him for the murder of Rhonda Boggs. Later that morning, Chief Forchie stood in front of a group of reporters outside the police station and proudly announced that his officers had caught Rhonda's killer and secured a full confession in less than 24 hours. But later that week, Detective Brooks was in his office, finishing up paperwork on the case, when a secretary stuck her head in the door and told him there was a phone call for him. Brooks picked it up. The man on the other end of the line introduced himself as Bob Sisko. He said he was a bandmate of Rhonda's husband, Dave Boggs, and he was calling because he did not believe for a second that Nick was guilty. Bob told a strange story. He said that on the evening Rhonda was killed, another one of their former bandmates, a guy named Chris Williams, had stopped by his house. Bob said Chris had been acting very nervous and agitated. He was pacing around Bob's living room, chain-smoking cigarettes, and just seemed like his mind was a million miles away. Bob then revealed that Chris Williams had a history with Rhonda and Dave. In the past, he had actually robbed their house, stealing a bunch of band equipment and selling it for drug money. So, when Bob saw on the news that Rhonda was dead and her house had been robbed, he couldn't shake the feeling that Chris must have been involved. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence. Brooks wrote down all the information and thanked Bob for the tip, but he wasn't sure how seriously to take it. After all, they already had a signed confession from their primary suspect. Still, he discussed it with Chief Forchie, and the chief decided they should re-interview Rhonda's daughter just to cover all their bases. A few days later, about 2 weeks after the murder, Chief Forchie was waiting by the phone in his office, anxiously watching the clock. The same social worker who had spoken to Amanda the first time was interviewing her again, and she was supposed to call him with an update at any minute. Forchie was hoping, praying, that the little girl would just repeat the same story she had told on the day of her mother's murder. But when his phone finally rang and he picked it up, he learned that was not what happened. The social worker told him that this time, when she asked Amanda who she saw on the night of the murder, the little girl did not say anything about Uncle Nick. Instead, she said, Bob did it. When Forchie heard this, a wave of anxiety washed over him. He had been afraid from the beginning that a toddler was not a reliable eyewitness. She could just be throwing out any name that popped into her head. But he also thought it was a bizarre coincidence. Of all the people she could have named, she said Bob, the same name as the man who had just called the station trying to point the finger at someone else. Something just felt off. But as Forchie thought about it, he decided it didn't really change the fundamentals of their case. Nick had confessed. He had admitted to doing it. They didn't really need Amanda as a witness to make the charges stick. So, 5 days later, a grand jury officially indicted Nick Robinson on murder charges, and then, to the complete and utter surprise of the investigators, Nick pled not guilty. He was now officially claiming that police had coerced him into a false confession and that he was not Rhonda Boggs's killer. About 7 months later, in December of 2002, a man named Matt Sauer stepped into a bar called the Merry Melody in Columbus, Ohio. He walked up to the counter, pulled a manila folder out of his messenger bag, and showed the bartender a photograph inside. He asked the bartender if he recognized the man in the picture. The bartender glanced down at the photo for a second, then looked back up at Sauer and nodded. He said yes, that was Nick Robinson. He said Nick had been in the bar 8 months ago, on the night of the murder. The bartender then said he had been waiting for the police to come and talk to him because he knew for a fact that Nick was there that night. Sauer was a little taken aback by how certain the bartender was. He asked him how could he be so sure it was him, and how could he possibly remember that specific night so clearly after all this time. But the bartender had a quick and convincing answer. He said the reason he remembered Nick so vividly was because Nick had been wearing a very unique, unforgettable t-shirt that night. It had an obscene joke printed on it about women's bodies. It was the kind of shirt you just don't forget. The bartender said Nick had stayed at the bar on the night of the murder until at least 10:15, maybe even 10:30. He was absolutely certain of the time. And so, the bartender said again that he was just surprised it had taken this long for law enforcement to come and confirm Nick's whereabouts. Sauer closed his folder, thanked the bartender, and set his business card down on the counter. When the bartender picked it up, he looked surprised. Matt Sauer was not a police officer. He was a private investigator, and he had been hired by Nick Robinson's family to clear his name. Sauer knew this was going to be an uphill battle. Nick had already confessed to the murder. But he was hoping this interview with the bartender would be the first step in poking a massive hole in the prosecution's case against him. Now that he had this solid testimony, Sauer left the bar, got in his car, and drove to the second bar Nick had claimed to be at on the night of the murder, the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. When he got there, he showed the staff the same photograph. And just like the bartender at the Merry Melody, they all remembered Nick as well. They confirmed he was there on the night of April 28th, the night of the murder. And they remembered him for the exact same reason, his distinctive t-shirt. At that moment, Sauer knew he was onto something big. The prosecution's entire case was built on a timeline where Nick left the Merry Melody bar, drove to Rhonda's house and killed her, and then went to the Fairview Inn. But the staff at both bars said Nick was wearing the same shirt. Sauer thought if Nick had violently stabbed Rhonda to death in between his visits to these two bars, wouldn't that shirt have been covered in blood? And wouldn't the staff at the second bar have remembered not just the distinctive shirt, but the distinctive shirt that was soaked in blood? That's a detail no one would forget. But they didn't mention it. They just said he was wearing that shirt. A few days later, Sauer drove back to the Merry Melody bar. But this time, he didn't go inside. He pulled his car into their parking lot, took out a stopwatch, and started it. Then he pulled out of the parking lot and drove the exact route to the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. When he pulled into their parking lot, he stopped the watch. The drive had taken him just about 45 minutes. According to the prosecution's timeline, Nick had left the Merry Melody, murdered Rhonda, and then driven to the Fairview, all within a window of 30 to 45 minutes. But Sauer's simple experiment with his stopwatch proved that was physically impossible. There was simply no way for Nick to have driven all the way to Rhonda's house, committed a violent murder, and then made it to the second bar in that amount of time. It just couldn't be done. Which meant Nick's alibi was airtight. He could not have been the killer. Now, Sauer just had to figure out who was. Matt Sauer took the evidence he had gathered to Nick's defense attorney. The attorney then presented it to the judge and made a crucial request. They asked for a court order to test a key piece of evidence that, for some reason, the Pascala police had never bothered to send to the crime lab, the murder weapon itself. The judge agreed, and the knife was sent for testing. A month later, in January of 2003, the results came back from the lab. They discovered there was DNA on the knife from an unknown individual, someone other than Rhonda. Back in 2003, DNA databases were not what they are today. You couldn't just run an unknown profile against a massive database. You had to have a suspect to compare it to. But they were able to test the DNA against a sample from Nick, and the results were definitive. The DNA on the murder weapon was not his. This cast serious doubt on Nick as the killer, but it still wasn't enough to get the charges dropped. Not until Sauer could figure out who that DNA belonged to. So Sauer went back to digging through the police files. He quickly realized there were a lot of potential suspects the police had never even bothered to look at. There was Rhonda's husband, Dave, who had been flagged by Rhonda's own sister on day one. He couldn't have done it himself, but he could have asked someone to do it for him. That meant all of Dave's friends, acquaintances, and even people he met in jail were potential suspects. There was also Chris Williams, the former bandmate who had robbed their house before to get drug money. And of course, there was Bob Sisko, the man who had called in the tip about Chris. At one point, Rhonda's daughter had even said the name Bob. Any one of them could have been the killer. But because the police had focused so narrowly on Nick, the investigation was essentially starting over from square one almost 9 months after the crime. The real killer could be someone the police had never even heard of. With so little to go on, Sauer decided to focus on the one concrete thing he had, a list of the items that had been stolen from Rhonda's house. He decided he would try to track down those items, hoping they would lead him to the person who actually committed the murder. A few days later, Sauer found himself walking slowly down the aisle of a pawn shop in Columbus, scanning the shelves for any of the items from his list. But just like all the other pawn shops he had visited that day, he came up empty. He was beginning to think it was a dead end. It was possible these stolen items were never pawned, or maybe they were pawned in another state. But it seemed most likely they would be somewhere in the general area. After visiting several more pawn shops and finding nothing, Sauer finally decided to call it a day and head home, feeling frustrated. On his drive back, he was stopped at a red light. As he sat there idling, he happened to look out his window and saw a Bureau of Motor Vehicles office, a DMV. The sight of it triggered something in his mind. He remembered reading in the case file that one of the persons of interest on his list had been arrested for car theft about a week after Rhonda's murder. But according to the same file, that suspect already owned a car of their own, a blue Cadillac. So why would they need to steal another car? On a whim, Sauer pulled into the DMV parking lot. He went inside, walked up to a clerk, and asked them to look up the records for that specific blue Cadillac. He gave the clerk the license plate number. The clerk typed it into the computer and quickly found that on the 30th of April 2002, just one day after Rhonda's body had been found, that exact blue Cadillac had been sold to a woman in Columbus named Letitia Gordon. Sauer left the DMV and drove straight to Letitia's house. He knocked on the door. The woman who opened it looked a bit scared when he introduced himself as a private investigator, but she also didn't seem surprised to see him. Letitia told Sauer that she knew why he was there. It was about the blue Cadillac she had bought. She explained that she had purchased the car from a stranger right off the street. He had offered to sell it to her for just $300, an offer that was too good to pass up. However, when she got home with her new car, she started cleaning it out and found a pile of stuff in the back seat that the seller had left behind. It included clothes, jewelry, and a purse. Inside that purse, she found a photo ID. The name on that ID was Rhonda Boggs. And with that, Sauer was finally able to piece together what really happened on the night of the 28th of April, 2002. On that night, while Rhonda Boggs was finishing up dinner with her daughter, her killer parked their blue Cadillac just down the street. That killer, desperate and in a rage, stormed over to Rhonda's house, stomped up her driveway, and rang the doorbell. When Rhonda opened the door, she looked confused and frightened to see this person on her doorstep. She asked them what they were doing there, but the killer just brushed past her, walked into her kitchen, and immediately started digging through her purse, which was sitting on the counter. Rhonda tried to stop them, but when she put her hands on them, the killer, without any hesitation, grabbed a steak knife from the knife block and stabbed her in the chest. Rhonda fell to the ground. She tried to fight back, to stand up, but the killer was on top of her, stabbing her again and again until she stopped moving. The killer stood up, backing away from Rhonda's body, which now lay in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Then, they simply continued to ransack the house, stealing whatever money and valuables they could find. As they were about to leave, they saw Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, Amanda, standing silently in the hallway, watching them. The killer paid the child no mind, hurried right past her and out the door, got back into their blue Cadillac, and spent the rest of the night on a massive drug binge. The next morning, they sold that car to a woman on the street for quick cash, accidentally leaving Rhonda's stolen purse, her ID, and her jewelry in the back. The killer was Chris Williams, Dave Boggs' former bandmate, the same man who had robbed them once before. On the night of the murder, he was high on crack cocaine and desperately needed money for his next fix. Rhonda had simply gotten in his way. Chris was arrested and charged with Rhonda's murder. On the 28th of March 2005, a jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 years to life for the murder, with a total of 28 years for aggravated robbery, burglary, and for escaping from a halfway house. After Chris Williams was charged, all the charges against Nick Robinson were finally dropped. For Nick, the entire ordeal was life-changing. Once he was free and back home, he stopped drinking completely. He returned to his job, and he filed a lawsuit against the city of Pascala for $3 million in damages for the wrongful arrest and the coerced confession that nearly cost him his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the morning of Monday, the 7th of January, 1985, a 31-year-old man walked through the sliding glass doors of a large international airport. He was trying his best to look calm, to look like just another traveler, but on the inside, a storm was raging. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he was sure the people around him could hear it. His palms were slick with sweat, making it difficult to keep a firm grip on the handles of the heavy, tangent-colored suitcase he was pulling alongside him. Every few steps, he had to stop, wipe his hands on his pants, and readjust his grip. He was nervous because he was at a crossroads, about to do something that felt both absolutely right and horribly wrong at the same time. On one hand, this trip was the culmination of months of dreaming, of planning. It was meant to be the first day of a brand new, wonderful life. A life he had envisioned down to the smallest detail. He hadn't packed much for himself, just a few changes of clothes, some toiletries, but he did have one very important personal item tucked away in his carry-on bag. It was a small, bound book filled with photographs, pictures that showed the single most important thing in his world. And that most important thing, that person, was supposed to be waiting for him in America, but on the other hand, a wave of pure terror kept washing over him. Before he could even begin to think about that new life, he had to get through this airport. He had a monumental problem to solve, and that problem was sitting right inside of the very heavy suitcase he was struggling with. He needed to get that suitcase onto his flight, a nearly 11-hour journey to California, without a single person looking inside of it. If anyone opened it, his life wasn't just starting over, it was over. And so, standing there in the bustling terminal, surrounded by the sounds of rolling luggage and announcements over the intercom, the man took a deep, shaky breath. He tightened his grip on the suitcase, handles one more time, and started walking towards the ticketing area. His plan was simple, at least on paper. He would walk up to the counter, hand over his passport and ticket, and check his bag. Then he would get on the plane. And when he landed in California, he would walk to the baggage carousel, retrieve his luggage, and everything would be okay. The nightmare would be over, and the dream could begin. Of course, he knew this was an incredible gamble. A huge risk. If there had been any other way, he would have taken it. His first choice would have been to just carry the bag onto the plane with him, to stow it in the overhead bin where he could keep an eye on it. But that was impossible. The bag was far too big, and it was unbelievably heavy. Anyone who tried to lift it would know something was wrong. So, checking it was his only option. The only other choice was to leave it behind, and that was unthinkable. He cared too much about what was inside to ever consider that. As he got closer to the airline check-in area, the line of people snaked in front of him. With every person that moved forward, his own turn got closer, and the knot of anxiety in his stomach tightened. He was starting to feel physically ill, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He thought about turning around, about just walking out of the airport and giving up, but he couldn't. He had to see this through. By the time he finally reached the front of the line, he felt dizzy, but he forced himself to stand straight. He walked up to the counter for Lufthansa Airlines, trying to arrange his face into a pleasant, neutral expression. The employee behind the counter, a cheerful-looking man, greeted him with a smile. He took the man's passport, glanced at it, typed some information into his computer, and then handed it back. Then came the moment the man had been dreading. The employee put his hand out, gesturing towards the heavy tan suitcase. This was it. This was the moment it could all fall apart. Trying to appear as casual as he could, the man lifted the suitcase off the floor and onto the scale next to the counter. For a split second, he panicked. The sheer effort it took, the way his muscles strained, it had to be obvious. He was sure the employee would look at the weight on the scale, look at him, and immediately demand he open the bag. If that happened, he knew he was finished. He would be arrested on the spot. But the employee didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He just grunted a little as he slid the heavy suitcase off the scale and over to the conveyor belt behind the counter. The nervous man watched, his eyes glued to the bag as the employee heaved it onto the moving belt. He kept his gaze locked on that suitcase as it rolled away from him, getting smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared through a pair of black rubber flaps at the far end of the belt. He was so focused on the bag, so lost in that moment of intense relief, that he almost didn't hear the airline employee trying to get his attention. The employee was holding his boarding pass, waving it slightly in the air. The man snapped out of his trance, took the boarding pass, and managed to mumble a thank you. Then he turned, without a second glance back, and hurried away to find his gate and catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, an employee for that same airline, Lufthansa, was making his rounds in the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, better known as LAX. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Los Angeles time. The employee's job was pretty straightforward. He worked in the international terminal, and he had to monitor the big circular carousels where passengers from arriving flights picked up their luggage. He was there to make sure no bags were left behind. As he walked his usual route, his eyes scanned the carousels. Most were empty, waiting for the next flight to come in. But on one of them, he saw a single piece of luggage, a tangent-colored suitcase with soft sides just sitting there all by itself. The carousel had stopped moving. He stopped and looked up at the monitor above it to check which flight it had been for. The screen showed that the last plane to use this carousel had arrived quite a while ago. All the passengers had clearly come through, grabbed their bags, and gone on their way. All except for the owner of this one lone suitcase. The employee figured the bag must be unclaimed. This wasn't a big deal to him. It happened all the time for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes bags got sent to the wrong airport by mistake. Sometimes a passenger missed a connecting flight. Sometimes people were just forgetful and walked right out of the airport without their luggage. Whatever the reason, his job was to start the process of identifying the owner and getting the bag to them. So, like he had done countless times before, he walked over to the carousel. He reached down, grabbed the suitcase by its handle, and prepared to lift it off. But as he pulled up, a surprised grunt escaped his lips, and he stumbled backward a step. The suitcase was so much heavier than he could have possibly imagined. It felt like it was filled with rocks. He readjusted his grip, this time using both hands, bent his knees, and gave it a solid yank. The suitcase toppled off the carousel and landed on the floor with a heavy thud. It was around this time that the employee noticed something else that was strange. The suitcase had no tags on it at all. No airline tag with a destination, no personal luggage tag with a name and address. Nothing. Now, this was unusual. An unclaimed bag was one thing, but an unclaimed bag that was incredibly heavy and had no identification whatsoever, that was not normal. He knelt down on the floor next to the suitcase. He was legally allowed to open it. Unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search to identify the owner or check the contents. He found the zipper and began to pull it open. But he had only unzipped it a few inches before he froze. His eyes went wide. For a second, he just stared, unblinking, at what he could see inside the suitcase, unable to process it. Then, a jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He scrambled to his feet, leaving the bag half open on the floor, and ran to find the nearest phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, at about 3:45 in the afternoon, Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in that same baggage area at LAX. He was looking down grimly into the open tan suitcase. He was surrounded by other officials from the LAPD as well as agents from the FBI. They had all been called to the airport because of what that Lufthansa employee had found. Inside the suitcase was the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was taken aback. He'd seen a lot in his career, but this was something else. He guessed the woman was young, probably not even 30 years old. Looking at her features, her dark hair, he thought she might be from an Asian or a Latin American country, but that was just a guess. It was as far as he could get, since she had no identification on her and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, no signs of a stabbing or a gunshot. He couldn't immediately tell how she had died. Ravens spent the next hour or so speaking to airline and airport employees. He also spoke with agents from Customs, the government agency in charge of inspecting bags coming into the country. One of the biggest questions on his mind was how a suitcase with a body inside it had managed to clear customs without being detected. But a customs agent explained that they didn't actually open every single suitcase that came through. They used X-ray machines and sometimes dogs, but physical searches were random or based on suspicion. This meant that whoever had checked this bag had taken a colossal risk. At any point, the bag could have been flagged for a search, and the body would have been discovered instantly. This suggested a level of desperation, maybe even recklessness, on the part of the person who did this, but it seemed their risk had paid off, at least initially. The bag had made it all the way to California. Despite that, Ravens didn't have much to go on. His victim was a Jane Doe, with no name and no past. He knew she could be from anywhere in the world, despite his initial hunch. And because LAX was a major international hub, the person who put her in that suitcase could now also be anywhere in the world. They could have gotten on another flight and disappeared. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators finished their preliminary examination of the scene, they didn't remove the body from the suitcase. They had the entire suitcase, with the body still inside, carefully transported to the coroner's office. Ravens hoped that an autopsy would turn up some kind of evidence, anything that could tell them who this poor woman was and what had happened to her. The next day, Tuesday, Ravens sat at his desk and opened the manila folder that had been delivered from the coroner's office. Inside was the autopsy report for his Jane Doe. As he began to read it, a sick feeling washed over him. The cold, clinical language of the report described a horrible, torturous death. The coroner had found bruises all over the woman's body. The report specified that they were the kind of deep contusions you would get from repeated, heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive. It looked like she had been brutally beaten, and her eventual cause of death was listed as suffocation. This meant one of two things. Either she was suffocated first and then put into the suitcase, or she had been put in the suitcase alive and had suffocated inside of it, trapped. Ravens put the report down and leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he had just learned. The autopsy confirmed that this young woman had died a brutal, awful death. But it hadn't brought him any closer to finding her identity. The coroner had found no identifying marks, no surgical scars, no tattoos, nothing that could help give her a name. And they found nothing on her that pointed to who might have done this to her. So, he was left with very little. He knew a woman had suffered terribly, but that was it. In the 24 hours since the body was found, Ravens had been working tirelessly. He and his team had pored over hours and hours of surveillance footage from the airport's security cameras. They were looking for anyone who looked suspicious, anyone who might have been seen in the baggage claim area and then left without any luggage. But nothing jumped out at them. He had also personally interviewed a number of airport employees who were working in the international terminal on the day the body was found. But none of them had noticed anything strange, anything out of the ordinary. And so, even though it had only been a day since the discovery, Ravens was already starting to worry that this case was going to go cold very quickly. But what Ravens hadn't counted on was the massive amount of public interest his Jane Doe case would generate. As soon as the story broke, the local TV news stations and the newspapers were all over it. The body in the suitcase story was shocking, and it captured the public's imagination. By Wednesday, just 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had spread far beyond Los Angeles. The story made its way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinosa saw a news report and immediately contacted the local authorities. He told them he believed the body found in Los Angeles might belong to his wife. The officials in Peru contacted the LAPD, and Juan's report eventually landed on Detective Ravens' desk. Ravens opened the file and began to read. According to Juan, he and his wife lived in Lima, the capital of Peru. His wife had been desperate to leave the country to escape the crushing poverty they faced. Her dream was to get to the United States, find a job, and send money back home to her family. She had left their home with the intention of trying to sneak across the border into the U.S. She had promised Juan that as soon as she arrived safely, she would contact him. But after she left, he never heard a single word from her. This felt like a very promising lead to Ravens. It seemed to check a lot of the boxes. His Jane Doe had features that could suggest she was from a South American country like Peru. It made sense. Ravens started to build a theory. Maybe Juan's wife had paid a human smuggler, someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally for a fee. He knew that the world of human smuggling was a dangerous, unregulated business. The smugglers could be violent and reckless, and the people they were transporting were incredibly vulnerable. They had no legal protection. Sometimes, these smugglers would simply rob their clients. In worse cases, they would rob them and then kill them to get rid of any witnesses. And because the victims were undocumented and their families often didn't know the details of their travel plans, these terrible crimes often went unreported and unnoticed. If that's what had happened to his Jane Doe, it would explain a lot. It would explain the signs of a brutal beating from the autopsy. It would also explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. A smuggler who had just committed a murder would want to remove any form of identification from the body or the luggage that could possibly be traced back to them. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, Ravens picked up his phone and called the LAX airport operations manager. He asked for the logs of any and all flights that had come from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. But when he got the information back, he discovered a huge problem with his theory. There were no flights from Peru that day. Not a single one. He checked again. The only international flights that had used the specific luggage carousel where the body was found were from 3 cities: Seoul, Korea, Tokyo, Japan, and Frankfurt, Germany. He even checked to see if there were any flights that had originated in Peru and had a layover in one of those 3 countries. There were none. This meant it was simply impossible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And just like that, his most promising lead evaporated. Now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no physical evidence to work with. All he really had was the suitcase itself and the body inside it. And the actual crime scene, the place where this woman was killed, was most likely in Korea, Japan, or Germany. He was an LAPD detective. His jurisdiction was Los Angeles. He didn't know where he should even begin to look for more evidence. He felt like he was back at square one. But then, as he sat at his desk staring at the case file, he got an idea. Detective Ravens stood up and walked down the hall to the department's evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable latex gloves. He found the cardboard box that contained the evidence from the Jane Doe case and opened it up. There wasn't much inside. Just a few sealed plastic bags containing the jewelry and the clothing that had been found on the woman's body. All of it had already been examined by the forensics team for trace evidence like blood, hair, or fibers. But Ravens wasn't looking for blood or hair. One by one, he carefully lifted out each of the sealed bags. He looked at a small ring, a simple necklace. Then he got to her clothes. He pulled out the bag containing a blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and turned it over in his hands. He looked inside the neckband at the small white tag sewn into the fabric. And there he found exactly what he had been hoping for. A jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He felt he was onto something. He quickly reached back into the box and grabbed another plastic bag, this one with a pair of gray pants inside. He did the same thing, looking at the tag on the waistband. Then he opened a third bag with her blouse and checked the label inside that. Each time, his hunch was proven right. All of Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them, and the writing on the labels was clearly in a language that was not English. Ravens wasn't a linguistics expert, but to him, the script, the shape of the letters, looked like it might be Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of the writing on the clothing. The labels were in Farsi. All of the clothes had been made in the Middle East, specifically in Iran. This was a huge breakthrough. Finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. She was almost certainly Iranian. But with this new information came another problem. It was really the same problem he'd had when he thought the victim was from Peru. There were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on, the ones from Korea, Japan, and Germany. None of them had originated in Iran. And he double-checked the records. There were no connecting flights from Iran to any of those 3 cities that would have lined up with the arrival time at LAX that day. Ravens felt like he was going in circles. He decided he needed the public's help again. On Thursday, 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down for an interview with a reporter from the city's biggest newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that had a wide circulation both nationally and internationally. The detective's goal was simple: to give the reporter as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that someone, somewhere in the world, would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward with information. However, the interview didn't really play out that way. The reporter asked a lot of questions, and for most of them, Ravens and his partner had no answers. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged. The last thing he said to the reporter, a quote that ended up being printed as the final line of the article, summed up his frustration perfectly. He said, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office early. He had barely taken off his coat when his desk phone rang. He picked it up. A police officer from Sacramento, California, was on the other end of the line, and he sounded extremely worked up. He told Ravens that he knew the LAPD investigators were struggling with the airport Jane Doe case, but he said he had an unbelievable development up in Northern California that he was certain was connected. He told Ravens that authorities there had just found another body. When Ravens heard this, his first reaction wasn't excitement. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He had a body. What he needed was a name for his Jane Doe. So he asked the Sacramento officer what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase? But the officer said no. The body they found belonged to a man. And this man's name had never been on any police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound 400 miles away from where Raven's Jane Doe was found. But, the officer insisted, the story they had uncovered behind this new body would almost certainly solve the Jane Doe case in Los Angeles. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Detective Ravens over the phone. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been discovered at LAX, a man named Hadi had driven to the Sacramento airport. He was there to pick up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who had been away on a trip for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Hadi always enjoyed being around Mahmoud. He was normally a very optimistic, fun-loving person. But on this day, when Mahmoud got into Hadi's car, Hadi immediately knew something was wrong. His friend seemed withdrawn and quiet. He was clearly very upset about something. Hadi asked him what was wrong, if his trip had gone okay. But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was just sick with the flu. But to Hadi, Mahmoud didn't look sick. He looked worried. He looked jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive away from the airport, Mahmoud kept looking out the windows, checking the rearview mirror, like he was afraid that someone was following them. When they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to his room and went to bed. And for the next 2 days, his behavior only got stranger and more paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment. He said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He spent most of his time just looking out the windows of their apartment as if he was watching for someone. But whenever Hadi tried to ask him what was going on, what he was so worried about, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 o'clock on Thursday morning, 3 days after Hadi had picked him up from the airport, Hadi was woken up by a sound. He heard the front door of their apartment open and then click shut. It was way too early for either of them to be up and about. And they lived in a part of the city where break-ins weren't uncommon. So the sound of the door was enough to make Hadi get out of bed and go check things out. But when he got to the living room, he didn't find an intruder. He found Mahmoud, fully dressed, in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend where he was going so early. But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was just going out for a bit. There was nothing Hadi could do to stop him, so he just watched his friend walk out the door. And then Hadi went back to bed. But as he lay there, he had this sick feeling in his stomach, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. About 2 hours later, the Sacramento Police Department received a call. Someone had found a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a nearby parking lot. When officers arrived, they found the body of a man who had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And on the passenger seat, next to the body, they found 2 Iranian passports and 1 boarding pass for a Lufthansa Airlines flight. Instead of everyone. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens this story, he said that he believed one of the 2 passports they found in that car belonged to Ravens' Jane Doe. He said he would send it down to Los Angeles that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive identification. And when the passport arrived, Ravens opened the package with trembling hands. He looked at the photograph inside. And there she was. He was finally able to give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud Ayazi's apartment in Sacramento, they would find one more piece of evidence that would finally explain the whole tragic story of how Katan Safawi had ended up dead inside an abandoned tan suitcase at LAX. That piece of evidence was a small, bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on the 7th of January, 1985, a deeply nervous Mahmoud Ayazi dropped off the tan suitcase at the international airport in Frankfurt, Germany. It was one of the 3 cities that had flights arriving at LAX that day that used the specific carousel where the body was found. Inside that suitcase was Katan. Mahmoud then boarded his Lufthansa flight to Los Angeles. His trip hadn't started in Frankfurt, though. It had started weeks earlier in his home country of Iran. He had traveled there for the happiest of reasons. His travel plans had gotten complicated on the way back, and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days, which only added to his stress. And now, he was on the final leg of his journey home, and he was more nervous than he had ever been in his life because of what he was carrying in his checked luggage. He had thought that once he successfully checked the suitcase and got on the plane, he would feel some relief. But as his flight took off from Frankfurt, his anxiety only grew worse. The flight was nearly 11 hours long. And for every single one of those hours, he sat in his seat, his mind racing. Every time the plane hit even the slightest bit of turbulence, he imagined the worst. He pictured the suitcases in the cargo hold shifting and crashing into each other. He wanted to scream. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flight landed at LAX. As soon as the plane taxied to the gate, Mahmoud was on his feet. He got off the plane as fast as he could and practically ran to the baggage claim area. He needed to get his suitcase and then get on his connecting flight to Sacramento. He stood by the carousel, his heart pounding, waiting for that tan suitcase to appear. When it finally did, he snatched it off the belt. But as soon as he lifted it, he felt a cold dread wash over him. Something felt wrong. With a shaking hand, he moved to a more secluded corner of the baggage claim area, laid the suitcase down, and unzipped it. And when he looked inside, a wave of grief and horror so powerful hit him that he almost collapsed right there on the floor. The trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, the journey he was now returning from, was a trip to his home country of Iran to marry the woman he loved, Katan. And now, lying still and lifeless inside that suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife. Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle her into America so they could start their new life together. After their wedding in Iran, they had traveled to Frankfurt. But when they got there, Katan had run into problems with her visa. German officials would not let her board the plane to the United States. Mahmoud and Katan spent days trying to fix the problem, pleading with officials, but it became clear that only Mahmoud, who had the proper paperwork, would be allowed to enter the U.S. Katan would have to stay behind. They were devastated. And in their desperation, they came up with a reckless plan. Katan willingly got inside that suitcase. Mahmoud hadn't murdered her, at least not intentionally. She hadn't been trafficked or kidnapped. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that he would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane. That's how they would get her to the United States and be together. When he had checked the bag in Frankfurt, she had been alive. But during the long flight, in the dark, unpressurized, and unheated cargo hold, other heavy pieces of luggage must have shifted and fallen, piling on top of her suitcase. The repeated impacts and the immense weight had slowly crushed her to death. The bruises the coroner found were not from a beating at the hands of a person, but from the brutal, indifferent force of other luggage crashing against her body inside that suitcase. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened the suitcase and saw what had happened, he fell apart. He panicked. In a fog of shock and grief, he tore the identification and tags off the suitcase. He zipped it back up, pushed it back onto the carousel, and just walked away. He abandoned the body of his wife and simply got on his next flight to Sacramento. And once he landed there, the full weight of what had happened, the guilt and the grief, consumed him. For 3 days, he lived in a paranoid haze, unable to tell his friend what had happened, unable to face the reality of his loss and the role he had played in it. And 3 days later, he took his own life. When the police in Sacramento searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip. The photos were of his and Katan's wedding. Pictures of 2 young people, smiling and full of hope, on what should have been the beginning of their new life together. The following week, the bodies of both Mahmoud and Katan were sent back to Iran. They traveled the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles, a long journey from California through Germany and back to their home. But this time, they traveled together. Sometimes, the most ordinary decisions, like boarding a flight or chasing a dream, carry consequences no one could ever imagine. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, there's a whole playlist waiting for you. Until next time.